Everyone, welcome back. We're still waiting for some of our other speakers in this panel to show up. But in the meantime, it gives me a lot of pleasure to introduce Tim Daly, who not only he represents Joyce Foundation, which was one of the organizations I mentioned earlier, with a shout out for their help in helping us put this this webinar on, but also because Tim is an active worker in the field of gun violence prevention. He's right now the senior program officer in the Joyce Foundation's Gun Violence Prevention and Justice Reform Program. He's a former staffer for several congresspeople, and he went on to become managing director for the Guns and Crime Policy section at the Center for American Progress. And while he was a staffer in Washington, he directed the House Democratic Gun Violence Prevention Task Force. So he's got plenty of cred, I think, to join this discussion as well. So, Tim, welcome aboard. We're glad to have you, and thank you again for all your help in putting this on.
Well, thanks, Stephen, for that introduction, and good afternoon. As Stephen mentioned, my name is Tim Daly, the director of the Gun Violence Prevention and Justice Reform Program at the Joyce Foundation. And I just can't thank you all enough for taking the time to join this important webinar series. And thank you to the folks at the Center on Media, Crime, and Justice at John Jay College for organizing the meeting. Stephen and Maurice in particular have pulled together just a very impressive list of leading thinkers, researchers, practitioners, and policymakers that are focused on the issue of gun violence. And I can say I've learned quite a bit from the discussions so far. Just for those that are not familiar or less familiar, the Joyce Foundation is a nonpartisan private foundation based in Chicago, Illinois, that invests in public policies and strategies to advance racial equity and economic mobility for the next generation in the Great Lakes region. And to that end, we support policy research, development, and advocacy across 5 program areas: education and economic mobility, the environment, democracy, culture, and the focus of this webinar series, gun violence prevention and justice reform. This work, building safe and just communities, is just so important at this moment in time. There are just too many cities currently experiencing a spike in violence, which comes on top of a tsunami of gun sales over the last 18 months, and as communities continue to grapple with the unrest following the murder of George Floyd. And meanwhile, the current public discourse on gun violence is, shall we say, all over the map. And for us at the Joyce Foundation, we hope that by supporting convenings like this one, we can enhance and deepen your reporting on this issue. And as a result, we hope that will give more space for the public to have an actual evidence-informed debate on the issue, and to allow for policymakers to act more decisively to address this epidemic. So again, I just wanted to real quickly join you and say thanks for being here, and I look forward to consuming your reporting on the issue in the near future. And with that, I'll turn the floor back over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Tim. So I think we'll start now. We're still waiting for some of our speakers. We have at least 2 to go, but what we'd like to do for this session, we're calling it a lightning round, and the thematic approach is we're calling the interrupters. So we've brought together people who are on the ground, in the grassroots from around the country, who've been leading successful programs at intervention, interrupters, ceasefire, cure violence programs, to get a sense, maybe a collective sense from all of them about what works and what doesn't. And what we're going to do in a lightning round is basically give each of them between 5 to 7 minutes to introduce themselves, tell us what they're doing, and then once they've all given us a sense of what they're up to, then we'll open it up to a discussion and then questions from you all. So I'd like to start just in the order that we have them on the agenda. First with Eddie Bocanegra, who is a pioneer really in the field of evidence-based intervention for individuals impacted by violence. He's senior director of the READI program, READI program in Chicago, where he oversees a trauma-informed program to reduce gun violence and promote safety and opportunity. And you may not know it, but Eddie is also a famous Hollywood celebrity. He was featured in the award-winning documentary, The Interrupters. So those of you who've seen it will recognize him. So Eddie, over to you first, then we'll move to, I think, to Adrian, and then Khaalid, and whoever else is on the board with us. Eddie, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a really pleasure being here, and it's kind of echoing Tim Daly's comments as well. Really appreciate the partnership that we also have with the Joyce Foundation and their commitment to change, right, through the lens of equity. So just appreciate the work and appreciate those who are also joining, who have been have the distinct pleasure of joining on this panel as well. So I just want to acknowledge that. I wanted to start off, Stephen, if it's okay, there's a deck that we have about maybe 5 or 6 slides, if it's possible to just put it on there, and
Sure.
as I go over them in the next few minutes.
So just share your screen and we'll see it.
Oh, I'm supposed to share it. Okay, sorry about that. Let me see how I do this then. Ooh, this is going to be pretty interesting. Let's see.
Yeah, it looks like it's going to work. There you go.
All right, let me just see how I could just focus on this. All right, can y'all see this?
Yep.
Okay, so let me give you just a quick background and some stats here, just for the sake of our conversation. I'm really delighted to be able to talk to in the midst of people who are in the space of journalism. I've been very fortunate to be able to build some good relationships with media, particular folks like Alex Kolowitz, Annie Sweeney from the Chicago Tribune. I heard folks reference the Trace a little while ago. Really appreciate the work they do and their data. I definitely use that data to inform my own strategies in our community, or as opportunities to just have a counter argument, right, for some of the master narratives that we constantly see out there pushed by politicians or sometimes even by media. So I just want to express my gratitude there. In a nutshell, I would just say this. In 2016, we saw a spike in violence here in Chicago. We had over 750 homicides and over 4,000 shootings. And this was, the highest in the last 20 years. Now, I grew up in the city of Chicago in the West Side in the late 80s, early 1990s, where we were seeing in Chicago homicides up to about 1,000, anywhere between 800 to 1,000 homicides. And LA was really, far surpassing those numbers as well. So in a time where there was extremely violent, and in the last, since then, 20 years after that, we've seen a decline of gun violence and violence in general. But what we're seeing, last year and potentially in the last several years is an increase of gun violence in specific cities. So in 2016, in large support by foundations here in Chicago, like Joyce, MacArthur, McCormick, and a few others, they responded to the spike of gun violence that we saw by coming together and formulating what's called a PSPC, which is a coordination of effort between some of the key stakeholders and foundations here in Chicago to really address the gun violence. And that came in several ways. I won't go through the whole linear there, but one of the areas that we're focusing on is what can we do right now to address the gun violence? And what has the data and research actually taught us that we could take some best practices or the evidence to think about what the future of gun violence could look like? And that gave birth to READI Chicago. And I would also just say that at the end of the day, READI Chicago is a program that's designed to focus on individuals who are the highest risk of gun involvement, meaning they're victims, more likely to be a victim or a perpetrator of gun violence. And we have an amazing partnership with the University of Chicago's Crime Lab to also help us not only evaluate the program through our randomized controlled trial study in RCT, which is, I would say, it's the only one in this country for this population. But it's also a way to dispel some myths, right? It's also a way to take the lessons that we're learning and share that across the field of gun violence. Because as someone who's been doing this work for way too long, the field of gun violence is a very stagnant field. And I would also say that the quality of services that we often provide in this field is also very low in terms of the quality. And so here we have an opportunity to really describe, right, through data and the research of what is it like to really support somebody who is more likely to be a victim of gun violence. And so in front of you, what you see is a quick snapshot of who it is that we're serving. This is informed by police data, hospital data. There's not a lot of self-reporting, although we do a lot of that collecting information too, as we think about the kind of supports that our folks actually need. And it's really focusing with individuals that are 18 years and older. So why is that important? Before coming to Heart and Alliance, which is also one of the largest nonprofits in the state of Illinois, I was the executive director at the YMCA of Chicago, where I managed all of our youth work. And I noticed, right, for years that there was a lot of attention and resources going to youth services. But when you looked at police data, when you looked at the data about who's a victim and who's a perpetrator, on average, about 15 to 17%, give or take 2-3 points, in terms of victims and perpetrators of gun violence were those that were under the age of 17, which meant that 80+% or so were those between the ages of 18 and older. But roughly about 55%, again, give or take 2 points, really were the focus between the ages of 18 and 29. And so I would grapple, right? You know, I went to UFC, right, to practice critical thinking. And so thank you, UFC, for this. But really, it didn't take rocket science or for me to get a grad degree, right, to realize how does that make sense? That you put bulk of your resources in youth services, but you have this population who's actually driving the gun violence, and we're not addressing that. And we're not addressing it in a way where it's sustainable, and in a way that really thinks about all the variables that really create that kind of situation for many of the folks who are in the spaces, right? So then you start unpacking and you realize how there's so much inequity, there's so much racism, there's a history, right? In some of these communities, gun violence is very concentrated, is driven by a specific population, and that happens to be true across the United States. Again, here are some fun facts about what we're seeing with our participants. How the program was designed to engage them. And in a nutshell, the program was designed to take what we learned in terms of, like, we know that jobs actually help reduce gun violence with this population. We also know that CBT with a younger population has also demonstrated to reduce gun violence. So imagine that you marry these two things, the transferable jobs and cognitive behavioral therapy, and then you pepper it with other services like housing or individual mental health or family engagement. Then now we're approaching more of a holistic approach to address these issues of pervasive gun violence. And even then, we're only scratching the surface. Again, this is a quick snapshot. When we think about this investment, right? When we think about investment and we think about equity, I didn't need for the situation with George Floyd to actually happen to know, right, that there was already so many inequities in our communities. And so what we did was, there is a specific population in our cities that are too often overlooked. We also know what we refer to as non-social service seekers, that they don't want to be connected. And so in our partnership with the Crime Lab and in our partnership with the other community agencies that we subcontract with, we use predictive analytics to identify high-risk individuals. And instead of taking a punitive approach by arresting them or scaring them straight, what we decided to do is, like, let's saturate them with resources. And what you see here in the last 4 years is how many people we've been able to serve through READI, how many people actually took the physical jobs aspect of the program, which includes the CBT. That is the actual intervention. And what you see, which is, I think, to edit this, it's really $10 million in wages and stipends that we've been able to put into the pockets of our participants. That's not including the other dollar figure that you see there in terms of hiring people from the community, train, build the capacity with some of our agencies to serve this population. And I want to put a pin on this. After speaking to DOJ, NIJ, the many federal agencies, right, people who've been studying this, here's where I've concluded. I've concluded that in past, too often, the people who are advising, recommending policies and so on, there is a disconnect there. There's also a disconnect in terms of who they're gathering information. Here's what I mean. When you have researchers talking about, gang interventions, all the different things that we hear about and what's working, what's not working, what I've learned is that too often researchers, policy folks are dependent on agencies who have an arm's distance relationship with individuals, meaning they're within an arm's distance of a person, right, of an employee. My experience has taught me, right, that maybe between 10 and 15% of the people who are driving the gun violence really fit under those programs where they have a connection with. The other, 85, 90% of the people, they're disconnected. Nobody's reaching out to them. And while there's many organizations that would say, hey, we have our doors are open, we embrace people, we offer jobs, we work with people who are coming out of prison, all of it, which is needed, by the way. I would say that what Ready Chicago has done is the total opposite. Is that not only have we identified individuals with the highest risk of gun involvement, and we have data to prove that, but we also go out there and get them. Like, they don't come to us. We go and find them, and we bring them into the program. The last thing that I'll say around this, and I'm going to see how I close this out. Let's see. Sorry. All right, I think I see everybody here. The last thing that I would say in terms of what we're seeing through this RCT, we're seeing over 30% less victimization in those in the Ready Chicago intervention. Those who are receiving the intervention, the dosage. And what we're also seeing, and this is where I would love for us to maybe explore more, is that we're seeing 80% less of our men in Ready Chicago compared to the control group arrested for murder or attempt murder. We didn't expect that number to be as high as it is. And this is truly comparing apples to apples. And again, the reason why I lift this up is because too often there have been models, there have been programs and good leaders that intuitively they knew this, but they couldn't prove this. And so the data that we're seeing in Ready Chicago is to allow folks like Adrian, who you'll be hearing shortly, and other community partners to really express of like, what does it take to serve this population, but also to demonstrate the impact that we could have for this population. That if you invest, right, in interventions that are specifically designed for this population, you could see a reduction of gun violence. Now, I've been very fortunate that 90% of our funding comes from philanthropy, but this program was also designed to allow the public sector to step in and support this. Lastly, and I know I said this already lastly once, but the last thing that I'll say, my perspective in this work, right, is informed by this. I grew up in the west side of Chicago. I witnessed both home, violence in my home, community violence, school violence. I was engaged in gangs at the age of 18, all the way to my adulthood. I went to prison at the age of 18 for a first-degree gang-related murder. But I've also graduated from a top university. I've traveled all over the world. I sit in various boards, the Public Welfare Foundation, several here in the state of Illinois. I've been part of transition teams. I've visited the president, 6 weeks ago, right? Had a close meeting conversation with him. Had the Attorney General also visit Ready Chicago just three weeks ago. So there's all these accolades, all these relationships that I've been able to build. And I say this because I also want to put a fine point on those who cover this medium. Is that too often, people like myself, when you highlight people like myself, it always starts by saying ex-offender, convicted murderer, ex-gang member. And I recognize that you have to write the facts of some things, but it's always how you write them. And for that reason is why I don't really do Spanish media. For that reason is also why I'm very selective of what media I do. And I've had to learn the hard way in my early career when I did Ceasefire, because I don't want to be the token. And I'm very careful and protective of my participants in our program and my staff. And so I hope we could talk more about that later today, but I wanted just to also put a fine pin on that as well.
Thank you, Eddie. So I want to raise a question that here that I also hope the other speakers in our panel can also address. Eddie, you mentioned sustainability as a key factor. And it strikes me that, in the area of violence interruption, of cure violence, of intervention, we now can really point to several generations of activity in this kind of field. But each time we get a whole new crop of recruits of people who are both the targets of the intervention, the people who are the interrupters themselves. And as an interrupter ages, somebody else takes his or her place. How do you create a program or create a system where we can learn lessons from generation to generation? So, we're not repeating the same issues over and over again, because it does seem to me in the sense that the programs that you and the others are doing are wonderful, but each time somebody else comes in, we have to relearn those lessons. So maybe think about that. Don't answer that question now, and let me go right to as a start to Adrian McGill to give us his immediate comments. Adrian is director of the Reentry Services at PowerCore in Philadelphia. So Adrian, over to you. Emily will put on some of your bio snippets on the screen, and then we'll go to Anthony, and we also have Myesha, Crowe, and Khaalid in the wings. Adrian?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be on here. It's always tough to go after Eddie. I'm like, I don't want to go after a celebrity, regular dude out here. But I'm the director of Reentry for PowerCore PHL here in Philadelphia. We're a workforce development program, but we're also a AmeriCorps program. We're one of the few examples of, I guess, a partnership with AmeriCorps. Like, most AmeriCorps programs serve a different type of population. But we've managed to create an AmeriCorps program that serves young people 18 to 28 that have been perpetrated or affected from gun violence. We on our staff have hired 2 and 3 time felons. It's really, our program is really about providing a way out. I came to PowerCore about 3 years ago to build out a reentry component to PowerCore, so we could figure out how to support young people as they were going through the program that were dealing with probation and probation violations, open cases. Young people are falling through the cracks. So I developed a program within PowerCore to help support that. I also have a newest initiative called the Trust Program, which is the road to an ultimate successful transition, where we focus primarily on young people coming out right out of jail. You have to give people, a way out of their situation. That's what PowerCore does. We spend about 40% of our money that we get on members. The rest is on training and staff. We're trying to really make sure that we're valuing young people's time. You can't ask a person that's been in the street to come work for $7, $8. It's not going to happen. You have to give them, an incentive to change their life. I know that may sound, odd to some people. Well, you're a workforce development program that's paying people to be trained. You have to value people's time. We really have to make the connection between adequate funds for young people. We're paying for prison. We're not building schools. We need to reshift where we're putting our money. We have to put our money in the community. I know that you had dropped a question about generational, poverty in a sense. I come from a community where generations upon generations lived in the same house and have been committing crimes out of that house, have been getting arrested, have gotten killed on that block. That is a systematic problem. It's not all in the family. People need real things to help them get out of these situations. And yes, you're going to have, people come and go in this field, but we have to build programming that sustains well after we're gone. Like READI Chicago, like PowerCore, that should continue on. That model should continue on, but we have to be funded. I've been in this work about 15 years doing this work at the level I've been doing it at, and you see programs fold, you see good programs fold. So when you lose a program or programming closes up, that, it kills the message. You don't have, young people having access to, quality programming. You have to give people an option other than crime. People are going to feed their families. I don't think people really understand how dire it is out here. But as a father of 3 children, my children are not going to be hungry. Luckily, I have opportunities in education that, I was granted. But people that don't have that opportunity, what do you expect them to do? You expect them to sit there and listen to their children cry, be hungry, not have clothes on, not have shoes. You have to understand that it's a dire situation in most communities. A lot of communities are like, it's like Baghdad, like really. My own neighborhood, Philadelphia, we have so many shootings in a night, it's ridiculous. And the shooting perpetrators of gun violence are younger and younger. We have on the call here, we have Samantha Malad, a reporter from Philadelphia. She's covered PowerCore. Just want to give her a shout out. When Eddie talks about, reporting people fairly, like report people fairly that are doing good things. You know, lead off with what they're doing. You know, everyone has a past. You know, you should not be made to feel ashamed of your past, but you know, your past is your past, and your future is what's going to be most impactful.
Let's move, if we can, from Philadelphia to Madison, Wisconsin, to Anthony Cooper, Senior. Anthony is the Vice President of Strategic Partnerships and Reentry Services at the Nehemiah Center for Urban Leadership Development. Anthony, over to you. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's awesome just to be here with so many phenomenal people. Eddie, Adrian, Myesha, hopefully I said her name correctly, but I've heard her speak quite often in a lot of different arenas. So if I said your name wrong, please forgive me. So actually I have a couple different roles that where I step into here in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm also the CEO for Focus Interruption, where we work with violent crimes in our community, but then also with my reentry hat on, I'm the Vice President of Reentry Services and Strategic Partnerships for Nehemiah Center for Urban Leadership. So, and one of the things that I can just almost say verbatim to what Adrian was saying, even at times a lot of folks think of Madison is because it's a smaller, I'm originally from Chicago, and we're in a smaller city, but the same crimes are still happening, right? The same things are happening either as much or just as random as any other place. And the fact that, you know, without strategic funding, without being able to give not only our younger folks to do, but also being able to connect with families and being able to help them navigate life, right? And those things, they take time, right? Everything doesn't happen overnight. Even the fact that, and I kind of jumped in, well, when I logged on a little bit later here, because I had the time mixed up on my end, is that, you know, even for myself, I was incarcerated at one point. I've been home about 20 years, but at the same time, I had to be able to keep moving, to be able to keep going forward. For most young men and young ladies, the hustle is in them to be able to do something different. But at the same time, if you do not allow programs to be able to feed into these young men and young women, they're going to end up being lost, and they'll end up jumping right back into doing the same thing that with what they know how to do, and not understanding that they do truly have a true gifting to be able to do something different. But it's the exposure, it's the whole thing, allowing them to understand that their time matters. So it's so many different pieces that where I just feel like the more and more that we do now, with adequate funding, with the right connections, and also being able to, what it really boils down to, we have to do what works. There's evidence that's already been proven out there that you're okay. Look, I mean myself, you know, I'm pretty sure other folks that are on this call as well, that the fact that with the proper exposure, you'll have proper examples to be able to change the reality of our young folks and their families. Because as much as we target, I feel like a lot of programs target younger people, but we have to target the whole family in all cases. Because if that young person goes back home to I guess a family that where does not have the excuse me, the proper standing or the proper support, they're going to end up right back in the situation. Right, so that is just some of the things that I think I'll just put that out there for right now.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you on that in a couple.
Yes, sir.
So let me go quickly now to Myesha, to Cleveland. Myesha Crowe is Executive Director of the Cleveland Peacemakers Alliance, and she writes of her experience at the Boys and Girls Club of Northeast Ohio as a therapist for homeless adults, has really shaped her passion to serve the community. So, Myesha, what's going on in Cleveland? What have you been up to?
Hello, everyone. I'm really, really grateful for this opportunity. Thank you for sharing a little bit about me. What leads me to do this work, I'm a mother of two amazing girls, and in this city and across the nation where violence is high, I'm really, really grateful for the opportunity to be able to create experiences and memories with my children, but also lead and share space with mothers who are fighting really hard for solutions and those who are also grieving? And how do we show up for them? And how do I utilize this position to lead an initiative in a program and journey alongside all of my colleagues on this call to figure out how do we create a space where communities can mirror restoration and love and community. So I lead an organization called Cleveland Peacemakers Alliance. And similar to my colleagues, we create a space for those who are the closest to the environmental risk factors that put them at risk of being at harm. And some of those harms are gun violence, being a victim or perpetrator of gun violence, being associated or involved in gangs, and oftentimes ending up in systems that are not going to help them to be successful. So there's many interventions and strategies that we use, and one of the most known ones is that we use people who are so grateful to use their past to interrupt the failures that may happen in the future of young people. And those people are outreach workers. On their shoulders we stand. And I heard Eddie mention, which I'm so grateful for, is that oftentimes we use these words that are facts, but we oftentimes do not use the words of healing and heroes and the individuals who continue to relive some of the hardest parts of their lives in order to help reduce racism and gun violence and any other incidents of violence in our community. So similar to other states and cities, there has been a trend of violence in our community, and people are looking to us since the Biden administration has finally put us on this platform that our work is needed and necessary to figure out what are the answers. And I think what happened in this conversations is that it's collectively having a conversation to be a lot more greater than in our circle. Like Eddie has been involved in this space for many years and has a lot of expertise, but until now, people were not listening to what is another innovative way of how we can interrupt violence. And having this opportunity now to involve journalists, to involve people on the outskirts of the inner cities that are the most impacted and the closest to the pain, that are oftentimes the story tells us that it's young people that are gang involved and have been incarcerated, but really it's the communities. If we look at gun violence as a disease and as a public health model, when we think about COVID, how we addressed that was that we treated the symptoms and we created a space for people to heal. When we think about gun violence, we don't treat the symptoms. We try to treat an individual and then put them back into an infected environment in which all of the underlying issues are still there, in which some people, which Adrian mentioned, they create a secondary economy, a secondary lifestyle that doesn't make sense to us. But if I have to feed my family and my record does not allow me to become a part of the bigger economic system, then I'm going to do what I have to do regardless of how you feel, right? So our goal is to create a space where we understand that it's not the young people who are at the highest risk with the risk factors, it's our environment that continues to create these environmental risk factors that we're overlooking, and we're placing the blame on young people. So I think in this space, we're creating a space where our storytelling is not to continue to push them down based on what they already may believe about themselves, but tell the story that we need to really treat this as a public health model and as a disease, and treat the symptoms, which also includes the family, right? Nothing has been passed down, but they're picking up things that's the closest to them. And sometimes the things in their environments are guns, are over policing, are overly medicated, are bad systems. And all of these things lead to the risk factors that our young people and families and communities are up against. So programs like this, although we have a specific population, in order to be effective, we have to understand that in order to impact one, we have to impact the community, which often will allow people to feel more safe and take pride in community and building. So there is a lot of pain, but there's also a lot of possibilities as well. And I think my colleagues and I are leaning more towards the possibility and not focusing on the problems, to collectively share space with more people so that we can co-labor and create and break those generational systems and patterns that we continue to see passed down.
Thank you, Myesha. Let me move quickly to Khaalid Muttaqi, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Advanced Peace and the former director of the City of Sacramento's Office of Violence Prevention. So we've gone now from Cleveland, Philadelphia, Chicago, all the way out to California. We've spanned the country. Khaalid?
Yes, sir. Yeah, thanks, everybody. Thanks for John Jay and the Joyce Foundation and the panelists and all the people out there doing the good work. every single day, the interruption work, because it is hard work and it is undervalued work. I'm going to put my PowerPoint to the side and kind of dive in, because I realize that the main target population for this presentation, or our audience, is journalists and reporters, and this is kind of unique. So, you know, and listening to my fellow panelists, you see that there's a theme that's coming out of this presentation. And one of it is, pretty much everybody presented so far talks about a lack of investment in this work, in this space of gun violence intervention and community-based public safety. And you hear this, and I'll give you some background on me. I have a government background. So I worked as the director of violence prevention, started with Mayor Kevin Johnson and worked in that space for 11 years, and now transitioned to Advanced Peace as the chief operating officer this past year. But I tell you, it's an interesting, I'll pose an interesting, hopefully interesting question, because it used to be that our government excuse was, where's your data? How do we know this is effective? And even though we didn't pose that bar of metrics for other public safety measures, for example, ShotSpotter, which the city of Sacramento continued to invest millions and millions of dollars in, there wasn't any evidence that showed that ShotSpotter actually decreased gun violence, none, period. But when we talked about investing in community-based public safety, gun violence intervention spaces, it was always these barriers and conversations, and show me the research. Well, now we actually are in the industry where we have it. Eddie just showed you a very drilled down, detailed data set, and other programs now have the research on community-based healing, trauma-informed care, and other gun violence intervention spaces. So in this context where we have this national conversation of you know, increasing safety, why is it that we still, all these individuals and all these cities that are demonstrating impact, that have proven to have proven strategies to reduce gun violence, why is it that they're still working on pennies compared to you know, other public safety efforts, i.e. policing, that are experiencing all-time high budgets? You know, that whole defund the police narrative backfired because they have now have all-time high budgets. And yet, you know, grassroots community-based programs continue to, you know, fight over crumbs. So I just want to put that out there because I think there's a story there, I guess is what I'm getting. You know, they say follow the money. And I think this should be part of the conversation as we look at what community-based public safety is and can be. So I just wanted to put that out there. Real quick, because I know this is a lightning round, but for those who don't know, Advanced Peace is a non-law enforcement, community-based gun violence reduction strategy that focuses on individuals who find themselves at the center of gun violence. And we provide a 18-month fellowship centered on healing and providing intense daily dosages of positive, personalized, individualized engagements to help facilitate their healing and personal transformation. It is rooted in a body of work that was originally developed out of Richmond, California, back in 2006, when Richmond is a part of the East Bay, a smaller city as part of the San Francisco Bay Area, found itself as the 5th deadliest city in America per capita. This innovative program was developed, and the last few years, it has been scaled with the research, with the data, to be proven to, once again, reduce gun violence. And so our premise is that a city or a community cannot expect to reduce gun violence if that is the goal. without servicing those who are at the center of gun violence and for whatever reasons have been able to avoid the systems of law enforcement. Because we know that in most urban cities, the clearance rates are on average 30 to 50%. So if you're a city, if you're on the high of that end, then that means your city has about a 50% clearance rate, meaning that the police department has been able to make an arrest. Now that's making an arrest, not a prosecution, but a police department has been able to make an arrest on 30 to 50% of those homicides. Well, even in the best case or better case scenario, that still means that half of those individuals that are at the center of gun violence are still walking the streets. And what we found, similar to what Eddie found in Chicago, is that when we finally get them into the program, 94% of those individuals who enroll in Advanced Peace were not receiving any type of community-based services at all, with the exception of law enforcement. But that's more of a public system. So, you know, you have individuals who are at the center of gun violence, and I think we can all provide testimony that takes a certain individual with a certain mentality to be a chronic shooter. And so you have these chronic shooters that are doing most of the damage and are not being engaged by anyone in the community. Doesn't mean that other community-based organizations are not doing great work in the prevention field, with the schools, with other community partners, and serving high-risk individuals. But the reality is, with all that work, the need always, there's always a disproportionate of needs versus resources. And so our main focus or contribution to this is there needs to be laser-focused efforts on engaging those individuals if you want to reduce gun violence. Now, granted, it is very hard and very challenging because most of these individuals, at least from our experience, are resistant to programming and are resistant oftentimes to change. But you have living proof on this call, and you have living proof in every community that personal transformation is possible and it is potent. And I'll just end with that, because I know that the title of this is Interruptors. And what we found is one of the most, I'll tell you 2 or 3 quick qualities of what we found to be effective qualities for interrupters. One is that they're indigenous to the communities that they serve. They are from those communities. 2, they have engaged in the struggle of self-transformation. In other words, they have looked at their own trauma in the mirror, and they've engaged in that lifelong process of healing, which can be a very, very painful process. And even most highly educated, well-to-do individuals are not willing to engage in their own personal trauma. And so these individuals have engaged in that personal process, and therefore they provide a life map to the younger ones that are coming into the program. And 3, and this might surprise folks, a certain level of humility. And this is not what's often highlighted on their resumes, but to do this work effective, because just a lot of different dynamics, including the resistance and the population that we serve. Because at the end of the day, this comes down to building a relationship with individuals who are not interested in being in relationship with you at the beginning. But towards the middle to the end of the 18-month program, a successful and effective interrupter can demonstrate and pour love into these individuals and see the good in them, and does not judge them for the worst thing they've ever done. And then in return, these individuals love their interrupters, believe it or not. And sometimes it's the first time that they've been loved genuinely. One of our interrupters often says that the essence of the work comes down to loving on folks who've never been loved before. And so that's what some of our experiences with this field of violence interruption.
Thank you. So I want to invite each of you to feel free to break in and to contribute whenever the mood hits you. But I'm looking for a couple of takeaways that I think I'm getting from each of you in turn is that while working with individuals as interrupters is quite valid and useful and productive, what's even more important, or perhaps at least as important, is working with the community. In other words, the ills and the trauma of the community itself is as crucial to healing and restoration as it is dealing with the individual. So we've been talking about public health in the earlier sessions. This is really a question of community health in one sense. So I'd like each of you maybe to think a little bit about what you're doing and relate your successes and failures to that ultimate goal. In other words, what you guys are the folks on the ground, basically. You're the ones who are dealing with this day in and day out. So what works in your mind and what doesn't work, and where do we need to go? So I can do a whip around, or whoever wants to speak first can give us their first sense. Maybe Adrian or Anthony or Eddie, actually, if you want to, you choose.
Yeah, Adrian. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, man.
How do you want to do it, man?
Look, I was going to say what works is love and humility. So you not gotta let you go because lead with love, man. Because like people have to have love in their life in order to feel whole. Like we have young people walking around broken from trauma, and they've become disconnected to the activities that they're involved in. Like when you don't have that thing in your life, it's easy to go fire a gun, when there's children around, or when there's, women around, when there's old people around, like you've gotten to a certain mindset. Like we have to, address the trauma. That's what Power Corps, that's one of the things we do. We bring in, trauma-informed facilitation. We have trauma groups. We work with Drexel's Healing Hurt people here in Philadelphia, to address these things. Even victims, if you've been a victim of crime, you live a certain way after that thing has happened. Like we really have to address all these little nuances that put people on edge. You can't have people walking around the communities on 7, their entire life, because things they're going to explode, repeatedly. Like minor incidences are going to become huge events. So I mean, love, humility, and just treating people with respect. Like, people don't necessarily, at least from my community, I can only speak from my city, people aren't looking for a handout, as the perception is. People are looking to, they're just trying to make their own way. They're trying to figure out, like, how can I, get off probation, or how can I get a job with 3 felonies? Like, they're trying to figure out, how can I pave my way in this society when everything is against me? And how can I do it with dignity?
Thank you. Who wants to jump in?
I can jump in real quick. And I think just to add on to that, as far as just really meeting people where they're at, right? You don't have to, because I mean, you have people who are out there hustling, but you can't tell me that you're gonna put me into a job or put me somewhere else, or whatever the case may be, but they don't have anything to replace it with. That makes sense. Not putting me in a job that's having making $4.75 an hour, not trying to, just have a program model and only be focused on the program. How do we jump from that and say, look, we want you to live life. Let me show you, let me show you, because there's a lot of brothers and sisters who in our town, and I'll say especially here in Dane County, is the fact that saying like, hey, a lot of people will call me Coop. They're like, Coop, how did you do this? Because all of this doesn't make any sense to me, right? How did you go from this to this? And knowing that it took time, but for some people feel is that, hey, look, I don't have that time. So it's meeting people where they're at, and then also you have to navigate life with them. And some are open to that, and some it may take a little bit more time. But the fact that when you have people who have the lived experience, but then also allowing them to know that, hey, you are important. You have skills that some of the times that they don't even feel that they have, and to be able to have the proper team to be able to pull those things out, to be able to, when you are placing them into a job, to be able to have the conversations and helping them understand more about that individual. Because the whole thing is, I have a partner now, but I'm so much more than my background. Or the fact that I went to prison. A lot of these men and women, they need to be able to understand that there's so much more than what their circumstances were.
Okay, let me thank you, Anthony. I want to go to Eddie immediately afterwards. We have some questions specifically for him. which I think would help us move the conversation along a bit. From Laura, of the Newport Daily News, who asks, when you say the field of gun violence is a very stagnant field, she'd like to know what you mean. So write that down for a second. Then another question from Stephanie Casanova is that this is more of a media issue, that you mentioned you didn't like the ex-felon headlines, and she agrees they're awful. But what's the right way to write a headline, or for that matter, refer to the people that you're working with, that doesn't tokenize these folks? In other words, the larger question here is, what does the media need to do to provide a more accurate and representative story? What are we doing wrong? What can we do better in terms of dealing and reporting well on this movement of community intervention? So, Eddie, if you could take that first, and then maybe I'll go around the table again to Myesha and Khaalid to ask for their takes on it.
Yes, Steven, sorry, you sound real low on my speaker. So, but I think I heard most of what you said here. Before I answer that question, let me just kind of highlight one point here about what was shared just a little while ago. When in Chicago, when we hear our mayor, or we hear other mayors for that matter, politicians talk about, we got to get rid of the gangs, we got to get rid of the drug dealers, right? I ask myself, who is she referring to? Because these are our neighbors, these are our family members, right? These are our residents. And people have to understand, like people in office, all of us, right, have to understand that based on the zip code that you were born into, or who your parents were, like what parents you were born to, really determines your outcomes. And there's so much evidence to support that, right? So we also have to understand, and you could look at, Thrasher was one of the godfathers of gang research, right? You could look at Irvin Spirago, right, back from the 90s. So much research around gangs, right? That we have to understand that part of the reason why those exist is because of the dysfunction, right, of governments, of the lack of community or lack of tribe, right? And so nonprofits often come into that space, not only to provide a service, but to become a substitute for what you just heard many of my colleagues here talk about, right? The absence of love, belonging, validation, right? Addressing trauma, pervasive trauma for that matter. And I can tell you, and I've been very public with my life, I'm 45 years old, I've been home 12 years. I would say that I'm very well accomplished. I live in a beautiful home, married, 7 kids. I'm doing very well. I struggle when I hear voices of individuals that I hadn't heard in a while, right, or whose names come up. It resurfaces old memories, most of which are not necessarily positive ones. When I see specific speakers talk about their experience around prison, it reminds me of those experiences in prison, right? And that all of it is unaddressed in many ways. And we also have to understand that for many of us, it's been decades, right, of really changing the way that we're thinking. And sometimes programs, sometimes governments, right, often expect solutions, right, transformation within 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 10 weeks. Even when I hear Khaalid, 18 months, British Chicago was also an 18-month program. We had to scale down to 12 months because we didn't have enough resources. And I asked myself, is 12 months going to be enough for some of the men that we serve, right, who've been shot multiple times? I forgot to mention, 34% of the men that we serve are gunshot victims. They're survivors of gun violence. And within that population, 43% of them have been shot multiple times. So think about what many of us here are working with, and what does it take to really support somebody who's been a survivor of gun violence or a victim of gun violence. To answer your question very briefly, here's what I would say, and I think somebody mentioned this in a chat, is that what often happens is that we are building, right? When I think about British Chicago, I would tell you, when I hear Khaalid, that we build on what was working for them. We just happen to have an RCT to go along with it, right? We learn from ROCA, we learn from other models, ceasefire, right? The cure violence. And it's important that we build from those best practices, right? What are they learning, right? And also that they're being where we are right now, how do we share it? How do we disseminate information? But one thing that I would say for your audience if you look at the models, and I'm not going to mention them right now, but some of them were referred, right? Some of them might even worked in the past. Those models are pretty stagnant, if you ask me. And it's not their fault. Like they did what they did and then allowed to build a field. We have to continue to build off those successes, right? And off the lessons learned. But the last thing that I'll say, if you look at the models that most of us report on, if you hear who the White House, what models they're lifting up, they're led by white people. I'm not a racist, but I want to say this, right? I think it's really important that I highlight this for your audience. Is that why is it that Black and brown people who've been part of the problem, or they live in the midst of these situations, right? Why are their models not lifted up? Because I could tell you some of the models that we've been looking at for some time go as far as the 1960s. Shoot, the YMCA, of Chicago had what they call the detachment program, gang detachment. That informed the field of LA and other programs of the 90s and 2000s here in Chicago, but people don't know the history of that, right? So it's like we forget where these things come from, and we're not willing to push ourselves, right, to improve the quality of our services, right, to improve the quality of care. And I would say to your question, I too often, right, it's like, imagine if each one of us in this call, imagine each one of us, every single time that you are introduced by, hey, let me introduce Stephen so-and-so or Anthony so-and-so, right, or Myesha, by saying they're a convicted felon, they did 15 years in prison, right, they were an ex-gang member. Imagine that for every single thing that each one of us did, the worst thing we did in our lives, every single time you're introduced by that one mistake you did in your life. That's what it feels like. And then you're embarrassed to share that with your family, right? Because it was highlighted. Even though the story might be good, it might be about the good work, you're still being referred by the past mistake you made. Mm-hmm. And that's an injustice. And media, right, both have the power. Like the media have the biggest weapon that I see out there in the streets. You have the biggest weapon. And that weapon is, how can you use your pen and paper, right? How do you use the power of this computer, right, to really think about the way that you talk about these issues? Not in a very punitive way, but more of a strength-based, right? And let the audience understand that they're still people, no matter what changes or what challenges they're facing. So anyways, I said a lot. I'll just stop there.
That's great. Thank you, Eddie. So I see Myesha nodding your head. There's a deeper problem. It's obviously the problem of the language that we use when we report or broadcast. But there's a problem that Stephanie Casanova points out in her question, which actually she phrases very well, is that, we're covering, or the media is covering, breaking news about violence all the time, and particularly now. So these are the headlines. If it bleeds, it leads. How do you cover that at the same time as you try to cover the movements that you're talking about? I mean, how do you mix those two? It's very difficult to cover the programs that you're talking about. For one thing, it's difficult to get access. People don't trust outsiders, whether they're white or black or brown, whoever they are, to talk about their lives and what they're going through. So what suggestions do you have to both Myesha and this to Khaalid as well, to sort of bring the stories to light at the same time as we have the headlines about violence breaking in Chicago or in LA or in Philadelphia?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that question. I think it leads to the importance of storytelling. And, my career wasn't based on storytelling, but a lot of what I lived and experienced create the stories in which people want to build off of, right? So oftentimes in this work, it's a lot of titles that is used called like pain pimping or, building on trauma and all of these things to create the story. I think what needs to happen is that we have those who are directly impacted by violence, and then we have those who continue to do what they need to do to be a success in a community that is continuing to be impacted by violence, right? But oftentimes those stories of how to navigate communities in which they cannot afford to live are not highlighted because gun violence or any other incident violence is high. So oftentimes in these stories, we're taken away from the joy or the peace or the goodness in these communities because we're oftentimes talking about the problems. And I think the possibilities of people being able to navigate in spaces that is already hard because they're the closest to the pain and closest to the risk and closest to the violence. And we talk about trauma, but we leave out the people who are directly impacted by continuing to stay there. So my thing is that I feel like as we continue to tell stories, myself and Eddie and Adrian and all of the other voices and the journalists that are here, is that we just need to connect to the humanity of people. Like, despite what the headline is, like, I'm a mother and I'm a daughter and I'm a friend and I'm an executive and I'm all of these things, but sometimes we don't connect at the heart. We just focus on the problem. So like, how do we take this story and how we need to tell it, but try not to further push this community into desperation and hope, because we're instilling more fear and more problems than we are possibilities and, you know, access and advocacy, is that these communities continue to live in fear no matter how many programs are created to address the problems. And how do we just use our language to say, we know that this is going, like, some things we can anticipate. Like, we know in all of our cities that summer is higher in violence. We know that. We don't have to continue to tell a story, but how do we emphasize and use our time and our resources and our talents to best prepare? Like, we don't have to put in the media, like, it's summer months and people are shooting their guns, but we can say, you know, to prepare for summer, collectively, we've created this impact because we know that this fight is hard and we prepared for it. We never hear conversations or read headlines like that. So oftentimes when the headlines are created, you have those who can only read headlines, and then you have those who continue to be a part of headlines. So I think in considering when you're writing the story, it's understand that, is that there's people who would never be a headline, ever, ever. But those who continue to be the headline, those headlines are putting more fear and more desperation and more hopelessness into the communities that are already rooted in trauma and that are under-resourced, and that programs like ours continue to be placed in with very small budgets and the biggest solution to solve, which is reducing violence. So I would just say, I said all that to say, just focus on the humanity part of it when we're thinking about storytelling and how we address communities, people, and programs.
Thank you. Khaalid?
There's really nothing to add. I think Eddie and Myesha said it. I think, and you know, I mean, I would just say the folks in journalism, you need to be creative. You know, this is one of you can't necessarily learn that in master's program. This is something that, like passion, you know, you can't teach that. So we need to expand the parameters and templates and bring some creativity. Some of the things I've seen that folks have been doing is, for example, is the word returning citizen versus formerly incarcerated. See, returning citizen, it does put, like Myesha saying, at least it keeps your human dignity. Keep human dignity in the forefront. You know, it's not offensive. We don't refer to our people as shooters or even participants. We refer to them as fellows. And we refer to other ones who may be in that life and causing a lot of damage as community members or residents. So it's finding a way to do that in a way that centers human dignity. And I think Myesha said, letting them tell their own story. Let them tell if they choose to share, like Eddie says, he's been very public about his challenges, but don't introduce him as a formerly incarcerated felon. If he chooses to share that with you in his personal testimony, because you're allowing him to tell that story, then so be it. But don't put that as his title and his description when he's a speaker at your conference. So let him tell his own story, and that's what hasn't happened. We haven't been able to, for various reasons, given those platforms to tell our own stories. We have to tell our own stories, and the folks in media have to hopefully give us more space to tell those stories.
So we have about 8 minutes left in our time period. We can go a little bit longer, but I want to, for the last part of our session, seize on something that Myesha mentioned, which is the fact that most of you are all living as under-resourced and in many ways unsupported in both your local cities and perhaps by states. I wonder if each of you can say a little bit about what the problem is. I mean, is the resources, do they need to come from the cities or states, the federal government help, what's the next step in building what each of you are doing on the ground into sort of an institutionalized approach to violence intervention? Whoever wants to answer that first is welcome, but or I can call on somebody first. But I mean, it's a question that obviously won't be answered in 8 minutes, but I'd like to hear your points of view.
So Stephen, I'll just say this, like, you know, all the reporters here, they have so much power. All the people, the panelists, right, in our existing organization have so much power and relationships. When you think about what's happening in Congress, we have for the first time, a president is willing to say, hey, gun violence is an epidemic and we need to address this, right? That's never happened, didn't happen with Obama, didn't happen with any other presidents. So you have so much that's coming out the White House that we want the federal government to support. One of them is like a $5.2 billion, initiative right now through the America's Jobs Act. There's other bills right now that are being trying to get pushed out. How do we bring awareness to that, right? In a way that really people could see the benefits across the country to do so, right? That these resources have been needed. If COVID didn't teach us anything, I hope it taught us that when COVID hit us, both government that provided services and local agencies like the ones you see here weren't equipped, right, to absorb how much demand our services were being asked for. So here's an opportunity to change that. Same thing with the ARP money, right? That's currently in many of our cities, states, and counties, right? There's an opportunity for us to step in and say, hey, we need to use these resources to build the infrastructure of many of these nonprofits or to increase the services that we're providing. One example that I'll give you, the Fund Peace Coalition. It's in a coalition led by Black and brown folks who are constantly meeting with the president, administration, folks in DOJ to say, this is what's needed. This is what's needed and this is why. And this is what supports this. So all to simply say that your voice, coalitions are really important to really make a difference in what's happening right now in our country.
Okay, thank you, Eddie. Let me go to Anthony and Adrian, Myesha, and then probably Khaalid for their maybe 2 minutes each, if you can confine yourselves to that.
I'll just make it really quick. So, I mean, just primarily, we have to be able to step outside the box, and our government, our funding agencies have to be able to step outside the box to be able to get the work done. Again, allow us to do what works and to be able to continue to go forward. The things that we need to change, we will change. And then also, because we do need your support. And also, if you're willing to be a part of that change, to step up, period.
Thank you, Anthony. Adrian?
I don't want to make any enemies here, but the politics in my city often holds up the flow of money. The same old programs get the money all the time. There are a lot of community organizations that are out here doing a lot of good work that have no names, but they're reaching people. They're trusted. People rely on them for different services. Like we're in the urban farming space as well with Power Corps. So, we see a lot of urban farms that are feeding people in the community, getting fresh food, to young children, to families. It can't be the same old players that get this money when it comes out. There has to be space for other, nonprofits and I know, politics might say, well, these smaller agencies, they don't have their paperwork in order. Well, help them get their paperwork in order, help them get the data, help them, because they are doing the work. I do see the results of other we partner with these smaller programs, and they're doing good work out here. They just may need a little bit of paperwork cleanup, a little bit of training on how to have their things in order so that they can take grant money and report out on the successes. Just open the field up. Shouldn't just be a couple of programs in one city getting all the money.
Thank you, Adrian. It's a really good point. Myesha?
I just want to say thank you for this opportunity to speak here to you all. I hope it was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. I think that when you think about support and building capacity, that although dollars are great, we all have talents, and we have time, and we have treasure. And if we think about it in that capacity of how do we grow, how do we raise awareness, where can our organization be uplifted to people who may not know, it's just like those are all opportunities for us to grow. So think about it in that aspect, like what can people donate to help us build capacity and to continue to grow in our messaging to people. So I just want to end it and say that like the lift is great. but our collective impact and laboring together is a lot greater. So just think about that when you're thinking about the stories and thinking about organizations like this that have small capacity but big problems to solve. It's like, how can you donate any of the three that you have to continue to allow us to be effective and most appreciated in this space? So thank you again for that, this opportunity.
Thank you, Myesha. Khaalid?
Second to all of that, I would say, so yeah, the media, so as a former government person for 11 years, I'll tell you, the number one fear from government folks is having bad press. So the media has tremendous power and influence in this space of reframing the conversation on public safety, gun violence, and the divestment in disadvantaged communities that we've seen over the last 3 or 4 decades. So I would just say, we're talking about money though. We're talking about funding for programs. We got to talk their language. Money, they understand money. I've been able to have conversations with folks who don't believe in advanced peace strategy, but when you just break down the numbers to them, they understand. So for example, for every time a person gets shot within a city, it costs taxpayers on average, national, every city's different, $400,000 to $600,000 per non-lethal firearm assault. In Sacramento, we had over 300 non-lethal firearm assaults last year. You do the math. Now, if that becomes a homicide, we're looking at anywhere from $1 to $3 million per homicide. Eddie laid out the data today for all of us. He said he can turn a person's life around for $25,000 over a 12-month period. Now, once again, we're talking about return on investment. Can any other program, not picking on law enforcement, but since they do tend to take up the share of the resources in most municipalities, anywhere from 30 to 60% of a city's budget is dedicated to police and fire, and they've monopolized this conversation on community safety. So we need your help. We need the journalists and reporters and the media's help in helping us reimagine and broaden that conversation of what community safety looks like. Because in our neighborhoods we work in and that we're from, it doesn't look like more police. It looks like folks on this call who I trust, and I'll listen to. That's what it looks like for our families and our communities. But like they said, people aren't listening. So you got to break down the numbers. And if we can help break down the numbers, a lot of times people who are naysayers, they'll say, that makes sense. That just makes economic sense. So part of telling the story is also breaking it down for those naysayers on an economic basis. And I'll just end with that.
Okay, thank you. I want to bring Tim Daly in for a second. I know, Tim, you're not inside the Beltway anymore, but maybe distance gives you some perspective. What role do you think should the federal government properly play in developing these community intervention strategies? And what appetite might there be, you think, now in Washington for that?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the question. There absolutely has to be a role, as has been discussed. The cost of these programs, I mean, they're not cheap. Now, that said, the return on investment is pretty high, and I think that education is now happening, and you're starting to see some willingness there. But the bottom line is that in order to successfully put these programs at scale, the federal government is going to have to invest a significant amount of money. Truth be told, if we were to do it the way that the evidence suggests, you would need more than $5 billion over 8 years that the president has initially asked for. So then the second half of your question, like, well, what's the political viability of that? Well, I think there has been a tremendous amount of education that's been happening over the last 2 years. I think among Republicans and Democrats, and again, particularly Democrats, I don't think there was a ton of understanding about these programs, the effectiveness of the programs, even for members of Congress in their respective districts. I can even say in my hometown now of Chicago, even among the congressional delegation there, I don't think they all have a wide understanding of what READI Chicago is doing. And it's not through no fault of READI Chicago's. It's just that these elected officials are, they go where the news is or what have you. I think over the last 2 years that has started to change. And I think in those states, and there has been efforts at the state level to try and fund some of these strategies, in those states, you have started to see some bipartisan support because we're not talking about things like controlling of firearms. We're not talking about limiting access to firearms. We're talking about interventions, and we're talking about root causes. And so in places like Maryland, for example, you've had some bipartisan support in the state legislature. That is to say that when there was a hearing in Congress about this about 18 months ago, there was some openness, some willingness amongst members on both sides. Okay, how do we do this? I think the sticking point will obviously be cost, and how much are we talking about? And that's why I think this this discussion about how much money could be saved and what is the investment, the effect of the investment, I think is really where the rubber will meet the road with some more of the conservative members of Congress.
Okay, well, we'll have to leave it there for the moment, but I just want to add that we will be posting for our journalists the contact coordinates for all of our speakers, which will allow you guys to finish up, try to get as many questions in as possible, but at least it'll give you the opportunity to ask each of them more specific questions. But in the meantime, I wanted to thank each of you for taking the time to talk with us, and to our audience. It's been really an honor to hear all of you, and we wish you the very best of luck and safety in continuing your work. So thank you, interrupters, and thank you to our audience. We'll see you all tomorrow afternoon Eastern time at 1 p.m. Where we have another really stimulating program for you. So thanks to everyone, and we'll be in contact tomorrow. Take care. Good night.